You should just sign these, David. There's no reason to make this harder than it needs to be. My wife, Vanessa, slid the divorce papers across the kitchen island like she was passing me the salt. Her face carried no anger, sadness, or apology, only detached efficiency, the same tone she used when reminding me to pick up the dry cleaning. She was wearing the red dress she reserved for client dinners and, apparently, the dissolution of our 6-year marriage. Her heels were on, her bag was packed, and she had no intention of staying for a conversation. And for what it's worth, she added, smoothing the corner of the top page with her finger, I'll be marrying Charles after this. He's already put in for the promotion. By summer, I'll have the life I was always supposed to have. Charles Merritt, Regional Vice President, her boss, the man who signed her expense reports, approved her vacation days, and made her feel as though the life I had given her was merely a waiting room for something better. For 6 months there had been late nights, work dinners that stretched until 11, and texts that made her turn her phone face down on the nightstand. I looked at the papers, then at her, then back at the papers. Okay, I said. She blinked. Okay? That was not the response she had prepared for. She expected tears, anger, demands for names and timelines, questions about whether it began before or after the company retreat in Scottsdale. I could see her rehearsed arguments waiting behind the shift in her posture, like a boxer who had thrown a punch and hit air. Okay, I said again. I picked up the pen, the same Mont Blanc her father gave us as a wedding gift, which I found almost funny, and signed all 6 pages without reading a single one. The speed of it threw her off so badly that she nearly forgot to look pleased with herself. I'll have Charles drop these at the courthouse on his way in tomorrow, she said, tucking the papers into her bag. His office is right across the street. That won't be necessary, I said. Why not? Charles won't be going to the office tomorrow. Her hand stopped on the zipper of her bag. What does that mean? Nothing. I stood up and poured myself a glass of water. You'll find out in the morning. Vanessa believed she knew everything about me. To her, I was just David. 9-to-5 David. Operations Department David. The man who bought the same brand of khakis from the outlet mall, got excited about board games, read too many history books, and never argued over whose turn it was to do the dishes. She saw me as small, unambitious, and safe, a choice she had made in her 20s and outgrown like a starter apartment. She was wrong. 6 years before I met Vanessa, I made an investment. I did not buy a stock or put money into a fund. I bought into a company, a mid-sized logistics firm called Whitmore Transport. I acquired a 25% equity stake at the ground floor, funded by an inheritance from my grandfather and every dollar I had saved since high school. At 26, I had no business experience or MBA. What I had was absolute conviction that the CEO, Arthur Walter, was the kind of man worth betting on. That bet paid off. Over the next 5 years, Whitmore Transport grew from 40 employees to more than 400, opened offices in 3 states, and secured government contracts. My stake became worth more than most people in that building would earn in a lifetime. Vanessa knew none of it. When Arthur asked me to join the company, I chose operations instead of an executive office or a boardroom title. I also worked under my middle name rather than my last, keeping anyone from connecting me to the capital table. Arthur thought I had lost my mind. You own a quarter of my company and you want to work in the mailroom? Operations, I corrected him, and yes. Why? Because I want to understand the business from the ground up before I take a seat at the table, and because I don't want anyone to treat me differently until I've earned it. He shook his head. Then he shrugged. Your funeral. For 5 years, I drove a forklift, managed inventory, and optimized routes. I came home smelling like a warehouse while Vanessa wrinkled her nose and asked why I could not get a real job, a professional job where I wore a tie and had an office with a door. I told her I liked operations. She rolled her eyes. After she went to sleep, I reviewed financials and fulfilled my responsibilities as a board member. At every quarterly meeting, Arthur and I discussed which executives were performing and which ones were failing. When Charles Merritt was hired as regional vice president 2 years earlier, I was one of the 3 people who voted to confirm him. I kept that part of my life private because I had never needed Vanessa's approval. I married her believing she loved the man I was, quiet, grounded, and secure enough to live without a corner office. I had been wrong about her. She was about to discover how badly she had misjudged me. I learned about Charles 3 weeks before Vanessa handed me the divorce papers. The affair itself had been going on for 6 months, and she had hidden it well. She deleted texts, came home at reasonable hours, and still kissed me goodnight in a way that almost felt real. The company's IT department flagged an unusual pattern in executive communications. A regional vice president exchanging 200 messages a day with a mid-level sales associate through company systems, especially after hours, created both a security concern and a potential conflict of interest. Arthur brought the report to me privately in his office on a Thursday. "David, I don't know how to say this." "Then don't. I already know." "You knew?" I nodded. "I've known for about 3 weeks. I've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" I let the question sit, because I had no answer yet. Maybe I was waiting for her to confess, for the guilt to become unbearable, or for her to remember that the man she returned to every night was the same one who held her hand through her father's funeral and drove 6 hours to rescue her when her car broke down in the middle of nowhere. Or maybe I needed her to cross a line so final that I would never spend the rest of my life wondering whether I had overreacted. The divorce papers erased that doubt. Her decision to leave was painful. The way she did it made the decision permanent. The red dress. The polished, indifferent tone. The way she described our 6 years together as an obstacle between her and the life I was always supposed to have. She showed no grief, offered no apology, and stopped using my name after the opening sentence. So I signed the papers, drank my water, and waited for morning. At 7:15 a.m., I walked into Arthur's office wearing a suit for the first time in 5 years. Arthur looked up from his coffee. He saw the suit. He saw my face. "How bad?" "Emergency board meeting, 7:30. You, me, the other 3 voting members. We need 48 hours notice for an emergency. The bylaws allow for a same-day vote in cases of executive misconduct that could expose the company to legal liability. Article 7, Section 4. Arthur stared at me. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. At 7:30, the 5 of us sat around the conference table. I handed each member a folder containing a timeline of Charles Merritt's relationship with Vanessa Chen, including dates, communications, and documented HR policy violations. The most damaging evidence went beyond the affair. Charles had personally approved Vanessa's last 2 performance bonuses while bypassing the standard review process. He had used executive authority to reward a subordinate with whom he was secretly involved. That turned a private betrayal into a documented conflict of interest and a serious liability for the company. "I move that Charles Merritt be terminated immediately for cause," I said. "All in favor?" 5 hands went up. At 8:45 a.m., Charles Merritt entered the building carrying a latte and a briefcase. Arthur Walter, the head of HR, and a security guard met him in the lobby. "Charles," Arthur said, "you're done. Security will escort you to your office to collect your personal items. Your termination is effective immediately. You'll receive the details from legal by end of day." Charles's face cycled through confusion, panic, anger, and finally something close to understanding. He spotted me standing near the elevators, and our eyes met. He opened his mouth. "Don't," I said. He closed it. Security escorted him upstairs. By 9:15, he was out of the building. Vanessa called at 9:32. She was screaming before I even said hello. "What did you do?" "Good morning, Vanessa." "Charles just called. He said he was fired. He said you." She was breathing hard. I pictured her in the hotel room where she had been staying since she left, the room Charles was paying for, perhaps still wearing the same red dress. "That's correct." "How? You work in operations." "I work in operations," I said. "I own a quarter of the company." Silence, 5 full seconds. I counted. That's impossible. Whitmore Transport. I bought in 6 years ago. Before we met, I've been on the board the entire time. I voted to confirm Charles when he was hired, and this morning I voted to fire him. The next silence lasted longer. You let me think you were... I let you think I was a man who loved you. That part was true. Something struck the floor in the background, perhaps a glass. Charles can't. I signed the divorce papers, David. I have nothing. You have what you asked for, a life without me. David, please. Goodbye, Vanessa. I ended the call and placed the phone gently on the desk Arthur had cleared for me that morning. My real desk, inside my real office, with a door. Charles Merritt never sued for wrongful termination. He knew what the folder contained. He handled his severance negotiations quietly and moved to another city, where he started over outside our professional circle. Vanessa's divorce petition went through uncontested. She received half our shared assets, which amounted to roughly $12,000, and a used Honda Civic. She received no shares in Whitmore Transport. The company was a premarital asset, acquired before our marriage and documented to the dime. Her lawyer tried. My lawyer laughed. She left the hotel within a week. Through a mutual acquaintance, I heard she had moved into her sister's spare bedroom in Ohio. Her sister apparently had plenty to say about Vanessa's choices. I expected vindication to feel like joy. Instead, I sat alone in my office that first morning and stared at the Mont Blanc pen on my desk. I had kept it as a reminder. The small, unambitious man Vanessa thought she had married, the safe choice who would sign whatever she placed in front of him, had never existed. I had been building something the entire time, quietly and patiently, the way I approached everything that mattered. She had simply never thought to ask. I still work at Whitmore Transport, only now my real name is on the door, and I occupy the seat at the table I earned 6 years before anyone knew my face. Arthur retired last spring. At his going-away dinner, I told him that firing Charles had to be the most satisfying board vote he had ever cast. Second, he said, the most satisfying was hiring you. He laughed, then pulled me into a hug that said more than words could. I think about Vanessa occasionally, but only from a distance, the way you remember a storm you drove through years ago, reduced now to the fading sound of rain. She taught me something I had never learned in the warehouse, the boardroom, or any meeting that helped shape the company we built. Sometimes the person you love will never understand your worth through explanations or proof. Losing you is the only lesson they will believe. And sometimes, if you stay patient, protect what you have built, and let people reveal themselves, you get to be the one who delivers that lesson. If that morning phone call kept you listening through the silence that followed, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments. Was firing Charles immediately the right move, or should David have walked away clean?